All right, so a couple of things before we start talking about Dorothy Wordsworth, right? Assignments for the coming week are up on the board. Fourth response paper is due on Friday. Remember to complete the vocab quiz by Sunday. And for Monday, we're moving on to the younger generation of Romantic poets. You're going to be reading John Keats's medieval pastiche, The Eve of St. Agnes. Now, did everybody get the email that I sent about the extra credit opportunities? Okay, there's 2 Zoom lectures coming up, right? So I just want to remind everybody that the Greg Carr lecture is 9:30 a.m. this Friday. If you want to attend, you have to sign up by tomorrow on Canes Connect. I suspect that using Canes Connect as the nexus for this is just a way to force everybody to use Canes Connect, but there you go. So does anybody have any questions about any assignments, about extra credit, about any of this shit?
The paper, is it, it's not a research paper, it's just a synoptic.
Okay, yeah, let's just go ahead and talk about paper 1 for a minute then. I'll put that up on the screen here, and we can all follow along together. So yeah, this is not going to be a research paper. The paper you'll do at the end of the course will be. But yeah, this is just going to be a close reading of a single text. Okay, so what you're going to give me is essentially going to be twice as long as one of the response papers, right? It's going to be a 1,000 to 1,500 word argument based on a close reading of a single text of your choice. So anything that we have read up to the due date for the proposal is fair game, right? You can choose any single text. Now that means, like, even if you've chosen one of the texts that we've looked at when we're talking about these larger movements, just pick one text from those sections, right? Instead of writing about that whole section of the anthology. So, like, if you want to write about one of the Gothic texts, right? Choose one of them rather than all of them. So, you are providing an interpretation of your chosen text, but it has to be a focused interpretation that relates to a single important theme or idea, right? There are going to be 2 stages. There's a 250-word proposal that'll be due a week before the paper is due, and then the second stage will be the complete paper. So, any questions so far? Okay, so basic formal requirements here, right? As per usual, it's got to be in Times New Roman font and 12-point type, just because my poor elderly eyes do not read these closely packed fonts very well. All submissions must be double-spaced. You are not to use secondary sources for this assignment, right? So don't look don't look stuff up. I've given you these bibliographies that you can use, but you don't need them for this assignment. And citations of your primary source should be in standard MLA format with parenthetical notation for in-text citations and a works cited page. Now, the way I want you to cite these texts is as works within an anthology. Does everybody know how to do that? One of you is nodding, the rest of you are just kind of looking at me. Okay, so in brief, here's what you do, right? In the body of the text, when you cite your source, just give me the author, last name, and the page number in parentheses after the quote, right? So, like, say, Equiano, what pages is that on?
107.
Yeah, like Equiano 108, right? So you're giving me the author of the excerpt, right? Not the editor of the anthology. Now, if you were going to cite this in your Works Cited page, which of course if you're citing it in the body of the paper, you have to, it would look like this, right? First, right, author name, right, Equiano, Olauda, from the interesting narrative, so on and so forth. You would have to put the whole title down, but I'm not going to because that would take up a lot of space on the board. Then you give me the title of the book you've taken it from, right? Norton Anthology. Of English Literature. Volume D. The name of the editor. The publisher. The date of publication, which for this is 2018. And then the page numbers for the excerpt, right? So this would be pages 104 to 112. If you look at the bibliographies I've been giving you, you will often see that some of the sources I'm giving you are essays in edited collections. You can use the same basic pattern to cite your primary source for the paper, if that makes sense. So this is how I want you to do your citations, right?
So we do the whole excerpt because we're analyzing the whole piece, but like what I've been doing for my response papers is just putting the page numbers that I use. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, for the paper, I want you to give me the page numbers for the whole excerpt because you'll be using the whole excerpt. But yeah, for the response papers, it's like, for the response papers, I mostly just wanted you to get into the habit of citing things because it's good practice to get into. Any other questions about citation? Okay. So the first part of this that's going to be due is a proposal. The proposal must be at least 250 words long and should be no longer than 300 words. So the proposal is basically just a description of what you intend to do in the paper, right? You're going to give me your working thesis and a brief description of what you intend to do to advance this thesis. So again, remember, you're merely describing your argument. You're not trying to make the case yet in the proposal. You're just giving me the basic outline, right? Your proposal should also include the following, right? First, a statement of the question you're trying to answer or the problem you're trying to solve, right? What's the thing that you noticed in this text that you're interested in dealing with? Your current working thesis, right? What's your proposed method of dealing with this question or this issue? And the most important background information your reader will need to understand your argument. That's all you got to put in the proposal, right? Just 250 to 300 words. I will evaluate the proposals quickly so that you can then put that into action for the longer paper. Now, does anybody have any questions about the proposal before I move on? Everything clear? Okay. So the paper itself, as I said, is going to be a 1,000 to 1,500 word argument based on a close reading of the chosen text. Does everybody understand what I mean by close reading? More or less? Okay, and I've given you some guidelines here that you can use to focus your readings, right? So if you don't know what close reading is, look through this part of the assignment and it'll explain a method to you. And finally, you also want to make sure that you are putting the text you're reading in its proper context, right? Now, this does not mean relating it to the author's personal life. What have I said about biography since the beginning of this class? Yeah, I don't give a shit about the author's biography, right? It does not matter to me what William Wordsworth ate for breakfast. It does not matter to me particularly, where he was born, how long he lived, that sort of thing, right? What I do want you to try to do is put the texts into larger historical patterns. So think about how the texts incorporate or respond to specific historical events, which specific historical trends and literary, philosophical, or cultural influences inform this text and how. So how is this text, for example, we'll say shaped like by the transatlantic trade triangle, right? Even if it's something that doesn't look like it's directly related to it. That's just an example of the kind of thing you might throw in here. What stance does the text seem to adopt towards its historical moment, right? Is it critical of its historical moment? Does it seem to be more or less in the mainstream, right? What's it doing in relation to its own time period? And finally, you might want to think about how the text might have been received by audiences in its own time. So we talk about some of that in class, and there may be some evidence of this as well in the texts themselves or in the editor's introductions. Think about how form and circumstances of publication might inform might have influenced the readership that it reached. Think about connections you can make between this and other texts in the course, right? And finally, I believe I have already said this when we talked about the response papers, but know back in the day and know in today's society, right? You are trying to understand this text in terms of its particular historical circumstances, and you need to be specific, right? So the proposal's due on Monday, the 1st of March. The paper is due on Monday, the 8th of March. I am happy to look at drafts of either the proposal or the paper. So if you have something done early that you want to show me, please do that, right? But make sure if you do want me to look at something that you get it to me at least 48 hours before the due date, right? Because that gives me time to give you meaningful feedback. Does anybody have any questions about any of this?
Did you mention the writing center?
I did not mention the Writing Center, but as I'm sure you all remember, you do get extra credit on paper 1 and paper 2 for going to the Writing Center, right? So yeah, if you go and work with a tutor, you will get extra credit on the paper. You only get that extra credit once, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go back, right? Any other questions?
Will we have to do like a peer review?
You will not. That's something that I only really do in the composition classes. Here you're a little bit more on your own, right? Like, I will help you. You can work with the Writing Center to help you, but yeah, we won't be doing peer review. Anything else? Okay, then let's just take a quick look at the grading rubric for this, and then we'll move on to talk about Dorothy Wordsworth. Right, so what I've got here, the way the grading rubric is laid out is in tiers, right? So you have to complete the requirements to get a D before you will get it, but basically, like, okay, how do I want to explain this? Think of it as like a pyramid, even though it kind of goes the opposite way here. The D is foundational, right? So this is the minimum requirement for getting a passing grade on the paper, right? Just that it meets the basic formal requirements. The next tier then is that you actually address the assignment, that you understand your primary source, that your sources are properly cited, and that you advance a clear thesis, right? Those are the requirements for getting a C, in addition to actually meeting the basic formal requirements. Then if your argument is clear, consistent, and arranged effectively, if your primary source is quoted directly and not just summarized, if opinion is not treated as fact, and you make clear and effective transitions between paragraphs, in addition to all of these other things, then you get a B. If the argument's original and nuanced, if you effectively deal with evidence that contradicts or complicates your argument, if you balance argument and evidence well, if you properly contextualize your argument and your argument is free of glaring historical errors, and you follow a single line of argument to its conclusion without digressions, in addition to all these other things, then you get an A, right? So this is what is required for each kind of grade tier. Yeah, Eric.
Alright. Argument is original and what? What's that mean?
Nuanced.
Yeah, what's that mean?
So nuance refers to things that aren't black and white, right? Right? So if you understand nuance, it means that you understand shades of gray and potential shades of ambiguity in the piece that you're looking at, right? So an argument that is nuanced is an argument that deals with ambiguity, right? The more specific you can make your thesis, the more nuanced your argument will likely be, right? Any other questions? Everybody good? Everybody got this? And like I said, if you run into trouble, right, I am here to help. So please do feel free to contact me and use me as a resource, right? All right. So let's talk then a little bit about Dorothy Wordsworth. And I want to start just by briefly telling you a little bit about the piece of music I was playing at the beginning of class. So the music we were listening to was a series of nocturnes written by the Irish composer John Field, who is a near exact contemporary of William and Dorothy Wordsworth. Right? He's born in 1782. William Wordsworth was born in 1770. Dorothy's born in 1771. And Field is regarded as the inventor of the nocturne. Now, a nocturne is a piece for solo piano that is meant to evoke kind of nighttime atmosphere. And I think that this speaks in some ways to what it speaks in some ways to Dorothy Wordsworth's journals, in that she seems to have a lot of her most important insights and revelations looking at the moon and at nighttime scenes. And also this notion of a solo piece, right? One of the things that she seems to be particularly good at is picking out lonely or singular details within something that she's looking at, right? She finds, like, the little lone blossom when she's looking at the plant, right? She'll, see kind of like lone people, lone animals off in the distance. And indeed, in some ways, even though she, is an integral part of her brother's household and creative circle, her life is also a kind of solo piece as well. So what did you guys think of this? How easy was this to follow or to find anything to hang on to?
Well, the
Okay, what made it difficult, Aaron? What did you have trouble with here?
The main thing to me was everything with nature, like,
Okay.
and like everything, like she described it like way too much.
Okay. Well, and I think one of the things we have to consider there too is what her actual purpose in writing this is, right? So we talked a little bit about this at the end of class last time, right? But essentially, like, what is a journal?
Written by herself, like collection of a day's thoughts or feeling,
Yeah,
person.
it's private writing, right? It's not intended necessarily for anyone else to read, although it seems that she did at least intend for William, her brother, to read some of this. And it also doesn't, because it's private writing, she doesn't have to give you the kinds of familiar narrative signposts you're used to if you're reading a novel, right? So what this means, there's often no particular explanation of either her thought processes or the significance of particular events or observations, in part because those would already be known to the author of the piece, who is also its audience, right? She doesn't need to explain these things to herself necessarily. So journal writing does often come off as kind of insular and impenetrable in that kind of way, right? It's hard to know exactly what private thoughts are lurking behind all of this, because often all we get is a kind of record of the day's events. She doesn't seem to be the kind of journal writer who spends a lot of time detailing her thoughts and feelings, right? It seems to be mostly observational. Now, there are exceptions to this. When do we note she does give us some indication of her feelings?
If she's crying, if she's walking on the shore or something. Something happened. Well, William said something or did something.
Uh-huh.
And she gave him a farewell kiss, I think, and then she started crying out.
Okay.
And then also the wedding.
The wedding, yeah. Let's actually go there. This is probably one of the most important and frequently talked about points in Dorothy Wordsworth's journals. Can I get a volunteer to read on page 418 the passage here with September 24th and following?
Mary first met us in the avenue. She looked so fat and well that we were made very happy by the sight of her. Then came Sarah, and last of all, Joanna. Tom was forking corn, standing upon the corn cart. We dressed ourselves immediately and got tea. The garden looked gay with asters and sweet peas. I looked at everything with tranquility and happiness, but I was ill both on Saturday and Sunday, and continued to be poorly most of the time of our stay. Jack and George came on Friday evening, 1st October. On Saturday 2nd, we rode to Hackney's. William, Jack, George, and Sarah were single, and I behind Tom. On Sunday 3rd, Mary and Sarah were busy packing. On Monday, 4th October 1802, my brother William was married to Mary Hutchinson. I slept a good deal of the night and rose fresh and well in the morning. At a little after 8 o'clock, I saw them go down the avenue towards the church. William had parted from me upstairs. I gave him the wedding ring, with how deep a blessing. I took it from my forefinger where I had worn it the whole of the night before. He slipped it again onto my finger and blessed me fervently. When they were absent, my dear little Sarah prepared the breakfast. I kept myself as quiet as I could, but when I saw the two men running up the walk, coming to tell us it was over, I could stand it no longer and threw myself on the bed where I lay in stillness. neither hearing or seeing anything, till Sarah came upstairs to me and said, "They are coming." This forced me from the bed where I lay, and I moved, and I knew not how straightforward, faster than my strength could carry me, till I met my beloved William, and fell upon his bosom. He and John Hutchinson led me to the house, and there I stayed to welcome my dear Mary.
Okay, thank you. You can stop there, right? So, what's weird about this scene? What stands out here?
Feelings towards him.
Okay, what about that seems strange?
She really loves him.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's a level of intensity here, right?
Yeah.
That seems like, what does she do the night before the wedding that seems to us odd?
She wears the wedding.
Yeah, she wears the wedding ring all night, right? And then she gives it to him in the morning. And he puts it back on her finger before taking it off to go put it on the finger of his bride-to-be, right? And then how does she respond to the news that the marriage is over and accomplished?
Did she faint or something?
Yeah, she seems to go almost catatonic, right? She just, she lies very still. And just, throws herself on the bed, neither hearing nor seeing anything, right? So, does this seem like she's happy about the marriage?
Kind of like she's pouting a little bit, like throwing a tantrum.
Yeah, this seems like a kind of singular disaster to her, right? Now, why do you think that is?
Because she has realized that now she's going to come second to Mary.
Yes. This doesn't necessarily have to do with any kind of like weird sexual connection between siblings, right? But one thing that we note from these journals, which she only kept over a period of about 5 years. After William's marriage, the writing kind of peters off, and it ends with this kind of devastating line that we'll talk about in a minute on page 419. Prior to this, like, we note how important she is in her brother's life, right? What kinds of things do we notice her doing with him or for him prior to this? What's that?
Reading to him.
Yeah, she reads to him.
Draws.
Sure, she draws. What else does she do for him specifically? Or for the household?
She's his secretary.
Yeah, she takes dictation, right? Right, he dictates his poems, and she writes them down. She also makes his pens, right? And she's responsible for managing the household and the servant. So she is doing much of the work, not just that a secretary would do, but also much of the work for him that a wife would be doing. Right? So it's fair to say that up until 1802, Dorothy Wordsworth is the most important woman in her brother's life. And then in comes Mary Hutchinson, marries William, and Dorothy is going to be relegated to a secondary position, right? So let's try a little thought experiment here for a second. This is a technique that a scholar of Jane Austen likes to try to get her students to stop thinking of Austen novels as romances. So I want you to imagine that the only people you know are the people in this room. Your only hope of ever getting out of this room and establishing some room of your own somewhere else is for one of the other people in this room to like you enough to take you out of it. If that doesn't happen, in particular, if it doesn't happen by the time you're about 25, you're basically stuck. And you're going to spend the rest of your life probably dependent upon relatives. Which, coincidentally, is exactly what happened to Jane Austen. Now, Dorothy Wordsworth's situation is further complicated by the fact that the Wordsworths are orphans. Their father dies when William is 13 and Dorothy is 12. So they're raised largely apart. Dorothy isn't sent to school because she's a girl. And, they're kind of shuttled back and forth between the homes of different relatives. I believe there were 4 Wordsworth siblings. There are 2 younger brothers in addition to William and Dorothy. So they have this little close family circle, right? At Dove Cottage in Grasmere, where Dorothy and 2 of her brothers live together. And she is in charge of that household, right? She's the most important woman in that household. The fact that she's an orphan makes her odds of marriage much lower because it means that she likely doesn't have a dowry, right? She doesn't have anything to offer a man who would want to marry her. On top of that, most contemporary accounts of Dorothy say that she was socially awkward and talked too fast, was uncomfortable in conversation with strangers. So it wasn't like this was someone who was going to be going out and meeting a lot of people, right? So William's marriage to Mary Hutchinson really does kind of mean, for a middle-class woman of Dorothy's particular situation, it really does mean a kind of closing in of her world, right? So however happy she might be for her brother, and she may be genuinely happy for her brother, she liked Mary Hutchinson, they were friends, this is a disaster for her. And I think we can see the level of disaster here if we look at the bottom, like at the bottom of page 419, the last line that she writes in the Grasmere Journal. It is Christmas Day, Saturday, 25th December, 1802. It's her birthday. I am 31 years of age. It is a dull, frosty day. I don't know about you, but particularly given the context I know for this particular, I find these sentences devastating. What does this suggest about the way she perceives her life and her situation on her 31st birthday?
She's lonely.
Yeah, she's lonely. And does she seem to expect that this loneliness will ever lift? And why not?
She's reaching the 3rd decade of her life in a time when life expectancy didn't go past 4 decades.
Not only that, but certainly, her marriageability is long past at this point, right? 31, we don't think of 31 as particularly old. But in 1802, a middle-class woman who was unmarried by 31, you're an old maid, right? You're a spinster by that point. So there's been, there is, and I will admit, there is a lot of speculation about what the precise nature of the relationship between the Wordsworth siblings was. And I think that passages like this and their reference to each other as beloved often fuels a lot of that speculation. But I think, like, when we think about this in context, right? One, orphans growing up apart. As adults, they have few people to rely on but each other. And Dorothy's basic unmarriageability. I think that we can make sense of this in ways that don't have to include ideas of an incestuous relationship, right? Although, like, we do find, like, there is a lot of stuff that they do or that she does in relation to him that seems weird, right? Like, if we look on page 413, can I get somebody to read the Thursday, March 4th entry here for 1802?
Before we had quite finished breakfast, Calvert's man brought the horses for William. We had a deal to do, pens to make, poems to put in order for writing, to settle for the press, pack up. And the man came before the pens were made, and he was obliged to leave me with only 2. Since he left me at 11:30, it is now 2. I have been putting the drawers into order. Drawers.
Mm-hmm.
Laid by his clothes, which he had thrown here and there and everywhere. Filed 2 months' newspapers and got my dinner. 2 boiled eggs and 2 apple tarts. I have set Molly on to clean the garden a little, and I myself have walked. I transplanted some snowdrops. The bees are busy. William has a nice bright day. It was hard frost in the night. The robins are singing sweetly. Now for my walk.
Okay, pause there, right? So far, what have we got here? What kinds of details is she relating to us here? So far in this entry.
She's pretty much serving William, being his secretary.
Okay, yeah, we find that she's doing a lot of cleaning up for him, right? So we find, that we learn, for example, that William Wordsworth is messy, and that Dorothy does a lot of the tidying up, right? She gives the servant something to do. She does a little work in the garden. She takes a walk, she eats, right? So on the whole, this seems like a relatively ordinary day in the life of a middle-class rural woman, right? And then what happens? Can I get somebody to continue from "I will be busy"?
I will be busy, I will look well, and be well when he comes back to me. Oh, the darling. Here is one of his bitten apples. I can hardly find it in my heart to throw it into the fire.
Okay, thank you. That's fucking weird, right?
She's clingy.
Yeah.
What's that?
Like, she's very clingy of her brother.
Yeah. And again, I think one thing that we have to remember is that, William is, like, by 1802, William Wordsworth is, even though they live out in the middle of nowhere, a well-known poet, right? His reputation is on the rise. He is her means of entry into broader society, right? And because she herself is shy and socially awkward, right, he makes that easier. This is also further evidence that William's a slob, right? That he'll just leave his bitten apple lying around. But yeah, like that she will attach this kind of emotion to an object that he has cast off, right? This piece of food that he bit and left lying around. Yeah, I mean, it's the intensity of this is odd to us, right? And when she says she will be busy, she will look well, is she doing that for her own sake or for his?
It's his.
Yeah. She will be well, right, when he returns, so as not to upset or to bother William, right?
When he comes back to.
Yeah. So we get a lot of scenes like this in her journals, in part because usually when William is around, she's too busy to actually write. So a lot of the writing she does either when he's asleep or when he's away. So we get a lot of her feelings about William when he is gone, right? We tend to get fewer records of her feelings about William when he is actually present. Because when he's actually present, she doesn't actually have time to sit down and write in her journal. But yeah, the other thing to note here is that we have a pretty solid description of some of the expectations that are placed on women of Dorothy's social class in the early 19th century. Right, so there's this idea that's called vocational philanthropy. Now, when we use the word philanthropy, what do we usually mean by it? What is a philanthropist?
Someone who works to do good.
Yeah, and in general, when we use the word today, we usually talk about a wealthy person, right, who gives a shit ton of money to some cause, right? So if Bill Gates gives several $1 million to distribute malarial vaccines in Africa and Central America, right? We consider that a philanthropic endeavor, right? We call Gates then a philanthropist. The meaning of philanthropy in the 18th and early 19th centuries was a little bit more general. Philanthropy referred instead to, like essentially, if we break down the two Greek words that it's made of, right? Philo, love, and anthropos, man, right? So it kind of generally means love of mankind, love of humanity. So I'm sure like several of you are familiar with those Christmas songs that talk about like goodwill to men and things like that, right? A lot of those are expressing this older 18th and 19th century idea of philanthropy, right? That philanthropy is just a sense of kind of general goodwill towards other people. Now, vocational, right? A vocation is something that you are called to. By some higher power, right? So a vocation isn't just like a job or a pastime. A vocation is more like a kind of sacred duty, right? Now this notion of vocational philanthropy is something that specifically applied to women in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Women were expected not just to show general goodwill, but also to make attempts to improve the people around them and their circumstances while also making sure everyone stayed in their proper place in the social hierarchy. So, for example, if we're talking about say, giving to the poor, right? You give them enough that they can keep body and soul together, but you don't give them enough that they can advance up the rungs of the class ladder, right? So women were expected to do these kinds of things to improve themselves, their families, and their neighbors, but without upsetting existing social hierarchies. So, for example, Dorothy wrote a work that she then circulated. It was written about two of her neighbors who had died and left behind two children. These were people who were of relatively modest means, right? They were kind of lower, like upper working to lower middle class. So they left behind two children, and she circulated the book by subscription rather than publishing it, right? So people would pay a subscription fee to get the book. In order to raise money to support these two children until they were old enough to do what's called going into service, right? Basically, they become servants in a rich person's household. She didn't want to publish the book. It has been argued by some scholars because if the book made more money than was necessary just to keep these kids alive and put them into servant positions, they might have made enough money to move up, right? It might have taken them out of the class position in which they are, in which they were born. And some of this has to do, again, with these kind of like with relative power structures within early 19th century British society, right? This is a way for women to gain some measure of power and influence in a world that otherwise subjects them to the vagaries of the marriage market, right? By helping to maintain these hierarchies through the correct applications of philanthropy, women are able to achieve some level of power and influence for themselves. So, to give you some sense of the operation of this, can we look on page 412? Starting with the sentence that reads, "Reached home at dinner time," kind of near the bottom of the page, middle of that big paragraph, on Tuesday, November 24th.
Reached home at dinner time. Sent Peggy ashburner some goods. She sent me some honey with 1,000 thanks. Alas, the gratitude of man. Oh, sorry. She sent me some honey with 1,000 thanks. Alas, the gratitude of men has, etc. I went in to set her right about this, and sat a while with her. She talked about Thomas's having sold his land. I, said she, said many a time he's not from.
Come from, yeah, fra would be a colloquial Northern English way of saying from, yeah.
Come from London to buy our land. However, then she told me with what pains and industry they had made up their taxes, interest, etc., etc. How they all got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to spend in Thomas Carter, and that they had paid off £100 of the interest. She said she used to take much pleasure in the cattle and sheep. Oh, how pleased I used to be when they fetched them down, and when I had been a bit poorly, I would gang out upon a hill and look over its fields and see them, and it used to do me so much good, you cannot think. Molly said to me when I came in, poor body, she's very ill, but one does not know how long she may last. Many a fair face may gain before her.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of things we notice here is like, one, she represents these, her neighbors here and her servant, Molly Fisher, by quoting them directly in the dialect in which they speak, right? So we're getting samples of Northern English rural speech here. But this also then keeps these other people in their kind of class position, right? Their class place, right? These are dialect speakers. That is, they're comparatively uneducated. But what else do we notice about Peggy Ashburn? What has she gone to, like, what seems to be the nature of her relationship with Peggy Ashburner? What starts this conversation in the first place?
She gives her goose and she gives her honey.
Yeah, she gives Peggy some goose. Peggy sends back some honey, right, to say thank you, right? And Dorothy goes to set her right, and say, like, no, you didn't have to do that. So it seems like she is regarding her position as charitable here, right? And the Ashburners are slightly undermining that by returning a gift, right? But then, what kind of impression do we get the impression that the Ashburners are poorer than the Wordsworths. But what other kind of impression do we get about them? Do these seem like hardworking people or lazy people?
Hardworking.
Yeah, they get up early, right? They're trying to sell their lands to get money, right? They're paying down their interest and they're working on paying their taxes, right? Apparently they owe a good bit of money. So there are two things to note here. One is that we're seeing here the effects of those enclosure acts on the rural poor. Or in the cases of the Ashburners, like people who would have been sort of comfortably rural lower middle class prior to the enclosure acts, but now land is a problem. And we're also seeing Dorothy demonstrating that these are people who deserve her philanthropy, right? The Ashburners, because they returned, they gratefully returned the gift, and because they work and they try to pay their bills, deserve this philanthropy. As opposed to certain other figures Dorothy meets throughout the journals. I don't think there are any quoted here in our selection for today that don't meet her criteria, but there are other points in these journals at which she meets people who she decides are undeserving, sometimes after having already given them something. But yeah, she puts herself in the position of deciding who deserves and who doesn't.
Oh yeah, she does do that throughout the journal, like giving people shillings and stuff.
Yeah. So the other thing that I do want to note here is the way Dorothy does talk about nature, right? So we've already discussed some of this, right? She looks for the singular, right? She looks for things that are poking out from behind other things. What else do you notice? Like, do you notice any other particular tendencies in her nature writing?
She goes into the description about like the flowers.
Okay, yeah, she talks a lot about flowers. What else? Are there other things that she spends a lot of time talking about? Or is there anything about the way she sets things up?
Trees, she describes.
Yep.
Like how she describes them.
Uh-huh.
I think there was one instance like with the wind, describes the branches.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something else, but she emphasizes those.
Yeah, and she often talks about trees as though they're not trees, or as though they're something else. Like there's, one tree that she describes as being like a water spirit. So yeah, she does a lot. She writes a lot of similes regarding trees. She talks about the moon a lot too, right? There's a lot of moonlight, and there's a lot of extreme weather. So I want to focus on just like one of these nature passages for a second. Then I want to show you a couple of pictures of the locations where all of this is taking place. Can I get somebody to read on page 413 on "In speaking of our walk on Sunday evening"?
And speaking of our walk on Sunday evening, the 22nd of November, I forgot to notice one most impressive sight. It was the moon and the moonlight, seen through hurrying, driving clouds immediately behind the Stone Man rock was visible. And the moon stood like a giant watching over the roof of a lofty castle. The hill seemed perpendicular from the darkness below it. It was a sight that I could call to mind at any time. It was so distinct.
Okay, so does anybody remember what the picturesque was?
It's like a mix of the beautiful and the sublime.
Yeah, it's a way of mediating between the beautiful and sublime. Yes, good. And how do we typically achieve that?
From looking at it from a distance.
Yeah, we frame the sublime in such a way that it distances us from it, right? So here she's looking up at the moon, right, from the top of a hill called Stone Arthur. That's what the Stone Man here is. It's a big, barren, rocky hill up above the village of Grasmere. Right. And she sees it through clouds, and every tooth and every edge of the rock was visible, and the man stood like a giant watching from the roof of the rock, watching from the roof of a lofty castle. So, what makes something picturesque is not the thing itself, but the framing, right? And in this case, right, it is almost, the moon is almost literally, behind the mountain, is almost literally framed like a picture, right? And a lot of her nature descriptions fit this kind of pattern, right? She'll describe a particular, apparently sublime image or object, right? But she'll do it in such a way that it looks almost like a pretty painting. So she is trafficking in this common Romantic era theme of the picturesque, in much the same way her brother was doing in Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey. So let me just show you now some of the locations associated with this drama, because this is a very place-based kind of thing, where it's taking place in a very specific physical and cultural environment. So the first of Dorothy's journals is written at a temporary residence that she and William occupy in Somerset in southwestern England. And this place is called Alfoxden House. They lived there from July 1798 to June 1799. It's near a village called Nether Stowey. And Nether Stowey is where Coleridge, in fact, they had moved to Alfoxden to be close to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who lived in this house in Nether Stowey. It's now a writer's museum owned by the British National Trust. But they didn't stay in Alfoxden long. So Somerset is this area in red on the map here. So it's all the way down in southwestern England. The Lake District, which is kind of like the famous locus of this early British Romanticism, is all the way up here in the north of England, almost up to the Scottish border. And it's this region where the Wordsworth siblings were born and where they were raised. So going to Dove Cottage in Grasmere, this is Dove Cottage, where Dorothy is living with William and their brother John, and then with Mary Hutchinson for the period that she's writing the Grasmere Journal. So Grasmere is a rural village, kind of like right smack in the middle of Cumbria, that red spot on the map up here, right? Grasmere is right about there-ish. And the mountain, or the hill, really, that she describes as the Stone Man, Stone Arthur, looks like this. Okay, so that should give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of physical environment that we're talking about here. Does anybody have any questions about anything before I give you the guide questions for Keats? Yeah, Aaron.
So the picture of that house, I mean, this isn't like the reading or anything.
Mm-hmm.
The picture of those houses, they have like the names outside. Are those like basically like a protected thing now, like a?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they're run. Yeah, they're run by the British National Trust, which preserves important historic sites. And like, typically you'll find like places where important artistic figures were born in Britain. They will often have like a round blue plaque on the front of the building. So yeah, places where like any important British artist or historical figure was born, you'll see that blue plaque.
Those are like 17, probably built in like 1760, 50.
Yeah, well, I think Alfoxden House, I think, is even older. I think Alfoxden House is built in the 1600s.
That's crazy.
And Dove Cottage is built sometime in the mid-18th century.
That's crazy.
But yeah, they're both still there. They're both still standing. Though they don't look quite like they did.